They heard the laugh before they saw the grin. It rolled along the concrete like a sparking wire. Young lungs, easy confidence, the sound of a dozen Marines who'd never yet missed a dawn formation or buried a friend. Gunnery Sergeant Vince Carver let it ride a second, then added his own voice, broad and cutting. "Hey, janitor, you sure you know which end of that broom to use? This side of the yellow line's for shooters, not sweepers." A broom paused mid-stroke. Brass casings winked in the heat as they rattled into a neat pile at Aaron Blake's boots. She didn't look up, didn't color or smile or slice back. Just finished the pass she had started. Push gather, lift, tap the dust off the bristles with her palm, and set the handle lightly against the wall. Her face gave away nothing. Neither did her shoulders squared under a plain utility blouse that had seen more bleach than sun. Above them, glass reflected a white rectangle of sky. In the range tower, Colonel Nathan Hale leaned forward on his elbows and watched the small things, the way Blake planted her feet under her hips when she set the broom away, how her head moved as if pulled on a slow, invisible track, eyes taking in the benches, the safeties, the line, the target frames, the wind's tug at the flags, not a janitor's scan, a shooter's, a professional's. He'd taught enough young officers to know posture from pretense, and what he saw in her posture made his mouth thin to a single line. A qualification range smells the same no matter the year: oil and solvent, hot metal and cordite sweat and earth. You could tell time without a watch zeroing in the cool marketing-approved photos at 9 nerves and coffee breath at 10 scores and excuses by noon. Carver ran this bay like a small country. He was loud because it worked. He believed in two kinds of Marines' assets and liabilities. He'd already sorted Specialist Aaron Blake with the latter. The broom in her hands had only confirmed what the silence of her file, the little he could access, had suggested. He turned back to his line. Front sights and front brains, he barked voice, riding the range's acoustics like a crow. You can't hit what you can't see, and you can't see what you won't look at. Index your grip. Lock your elbows. Don't milk the trigger like it owes you money. The recruits laughed again, a brittle chorus fed by relief. No one wanted the tone of that joke aimed at them. Blake's broom whisked. Brass chimed. Far downrange heat shimmered above the berm in fine, oily waves. The bay was a tunnel of summer humid air you could chew. Hale checked the roster again. The last relay had a dropout. A private had failed to clear a stoppage and earned himself a remedial block. The firing line stood one body short. He keyed the tower mic. "Lane 4 is open," he said the words steady as a metronome. "Fill it." Carver put his hands on his hips, grin, cocked eyes sweeping for a spare. He found none. Then his gaze snagged on the woman by the wall. It would be perfect theater. Another snort for the line. One more reminder that this was a place where people like him ran things and people like her kept things tidy. He opened his mouth. "Specialist Blake, Lane 4. Hale's voice cut the air like a whistle. "Now." A hush fell with a slap. Carver half-turned toward the tower, surprise ripping across his face before discipline snapped the mask back in place. "Sir, with respect," he began. "Lane 4 gunny." Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Blake didn't hurry. She never did. She slid her fingers along the broom handle until she found the balance point, set it carefully between the wall racks, and brushed her palms against her trousers, as if dust might impede a later task she hadn't yet named. She walked the 10 yards to the line in an ordinary way that somehow drew every eye, heel-toe, shoulders, quiet, hands free. She stopped at Lane 4's bench and reached for the standard issue M18 resting there. There's a difference between a person who has held a pistol and a person whose hands know its balance, the way a carpenter knows a hammer's swing. Blake's hand cupped the grip, once tested the weight, and brought the pistol down to the bench again. Her fingers ran the checks in a pattern as clean and silent as Prayer magazine, seated slide forward and locked chamber clear sights, even safety as designed. She stepped into a perfect natural stance without looking at her feet, because her feet knew where they belonged. The recruits' faces shifted one by one, grins thinned. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" No one answered. "Shooter ready." Carver called the words automatic. He could hear his own breathing tight in his throat. Blake didn't speak. She let one breath out, found another, and placed it just behind her collarbone where it would do the most good. Her eyes went to the X-ring like a magnet coming home. The buzzer's screech split the heat. What happened next was less a draw than an absence of everything that wasn't the draw. No flourish, no shoulder pop, no chin jut. A simple coiled rotation elbow, tight hand to grip thumb, clears retention web, high under the tang. Muzzle up sights arrive already married to the eye. The pistol didn't leap. It appeared where it belonged. Two reports overlapped so closely, they were a single word of thunder, with a faint echo crack, crack, and then the world snapped back to quiet, like a rubber band released. For a heartbeat, no one blinked. 3, 5, lens-bright sunlight poured into the bay and pooled on the floor. Downrange, the paper target at 50 feet showed not a center hit, not a tight cluster, but a tiny figure 8 drilled into the nub of black where the X-ring lives. The holes were so close their edges kissed. A surgeon's mark, a watchmaker's cut. The kind of controlled pair you hear about at reunions and doubt in your bones until you see it with your own eyes. Someone swore softly. Someone else stopped himself just in time. Carver's jaw opened and didn't close. You could have set a coin on his tongue and counted to 10 before gravity found it again. Blake's right thumb eased the safety. Her left palm found the frame. She brought the pistol back to low. Ready thumbed the mag release. Caught the magazine with the other hand, locked the slide. Checked the chamber again, a shape poured from 1,000 repetitions, and set the M18 on the bench as carefully as she'd set the broom. She did not smile. She did not look left or right. She did not ask. Any questions? She stepped off the line, gave Carver a polite inch of space as she passed him and stopped with her hands folded in front of her. The range had not moved yet. The only sound was the faint tick of brass cooling in the sun. Colonel Hale's boots made their own quiet, measured sound on the tower stairs. He walked straight to the range desk, where a tablet lay under a clipboard and a coil of earplugs. "Open the active roster," he said to the staff sergeant manning it. "Pull specialist Aaron Blake." The staff sergeant tapped, then frowned. "Access blocked." "Sir, this one's." Hale held out his hand. "Authorization Olympus Actual." The room heard it. The room went stiller. Carver's eyes flicked to the recruits, then to the men with stripes, who suddenly had the sense to study their boots. The file rode the air between tablet and colonel, invisible, but present as gravity. Hale read a line, then another, and then so everyone could hear. He read the pieces that would change the shape of the day. Name, Blake, Aaron, M, rank, Chief Warrant Officer 4. Unit, Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command. Primary Billet Operator Detachment, 1 Direct Action Element. Secondary, MOS, Master Weapons Instructor, CQB Division. Decorations and badges, Distinguished Marksman 3 gold devices. Inter-Service Pistol Champion 3-time undefeated. Additional qualifications. He paused, eyes moving, kept the rest to himself. Some things didn't need air. A sound like wind rippled through the bay. It was breath, dozens of people letting it go at once. Carver's throat bobbed. Aaron Blake looked at no one. Hale stepped in front of her boots, together shoulders square, and brought his right hand up to his brow in a slow, perfect salute. It was not form. It was recognition. It said, "I know what I am seeing. I know what it cost to become it. I know what it means for the rest of us." Blake returned the salute with the same spare economy she brought to everything else. No flourish, no delay. "Ma'am," Hale said, when his arm came down the single syllable, carrying a weight that turned faces away out of respect. "My apologies for the interruption to your duties. Thank you for your instruction." Carver found his feet. He found his voice after a fashion. "Sir, I—" Chief words betrayed him in the precise way his assumptions had betrayed him a minute earlier. Blake did not save him. She did not hang him. She gave him the same mercy she'd given the target, no excess movement. "I have time after Chowgunny," she said quietly. "We can talk through it." Hale turned to the line. Reset. New string. The ordinary noises of a range came back in pieces, slides slapping forward safeties, clicked a cough, a foot scuffed. A world reordered by 2 small holes resumed its work. There are apologies that plead for public absolution and apologies that seek private repair. Vince Carver chose the second. He didn't try to steal the moment. He didn't invent a task to check up on or a meeting to duck into. He waited outside the armory that afternoon, where the shade under the overhang felt 5 degrees cooler than the parade deck beyond. He took his cover off and held it in his hands. Blake came out with a field case under one arm and a range kit slung across her shoulder. He straightened instinctively. The words tasted new in his mouth. "Chief," he said, "I was ignorant. I was unprofessional. I was wrong. If you could," he swallowed, "if you'd be willing to show me what I didn't see, I'd be grateful." If she had offered him a lecture, he would have endured it. If she had declined, he would have deserved that too. Instead, she tipped her head toward the quiet end of the bay and led him to a corner where spare target stands leaned like crossed bones, and the floor smelled less like solvent and more like dust. "Unload and show clear," she said. The cadence was easy, the words mild. Carver did as he was told. Blake set a blue-handled dummy pistol on the bench and slid a box of inert rounds out of her kit. "The draw," she began, "is not what you think it is. It isn't speed, it's sequence. Speed's a side effect. Get the parts right. The time will take care of itself." She put the training pistol on her belt squared to an imaginary target and spoke as her hands moved, elbow pivot, hand high, grip full. Retention clicked, muzzle indexed, join at the midline, sights arrive, press. "Your elbow is a hinge. Keep it tight. The motion isn't from the shoulder. It's driven from your center. Hips quiet. Bring the gun to your eye, not your eye to the gun. Don't scoop. Don't present like you're on a stage. Place it where it needs to be." He tried it slow. It felt foreign and familiar at once. She adjusted nothing and corrected everything. "You're hunting for it," she said when his head chased the sights. "Trust that they're there. You paid for good sights. Let them do their job." He tried again. "Better," she said, and the single word landed harder than any roar. Trigger, Blake said, "It's not something you pull. It's something you press in line with the bore. Imagine you're closing a drawer that sticks a little. You don't yank it, you lean into it until it yields. Straight, press to the wall, measure the movement. Don't let your other fingers join the party." She loaded the dummy with an inert magazine, racked it once, and handed it to him. "Front sight low, ready to sighted press, don't slap. Watch what your support hand does. You like to help when help isn't needed." He worked the drill in 8s, then 4s, then 2s. She didn't feed him praise. She clipped off small, exact adjustments that had nothing to do with his pride and everything to do with his hands. "Your wrist is collapsing at the heel. Lock it. Good. Don't crush the grip. Marry it. The gun's going to cycle whether you scowl or not." He grinned, despite himself. "Yes, ma'am." "Stop talking," she said, and he laughed. They ran malfunctions with dummy rounds until his fingers found the magazine release without his eyes' permission. They worked the draw on a metronome she set on her phone, 2 seconds, then 1 3/4, then 1 1/2. "Smooth is fast," she said. Not because smooth means slow, because smooth cuts out the wasted motions that make slow feel fast. When he botched a sequence, she didn't sigh. She reset, again. And when he got one right, she didn't clap. Again. At the end of 20 minutes, his shirt stuck to his back and the heel of his hand felt warm where the polymer had ridden. Blake holstered, took a step back and pointed to the floor, not to the target stands. "Before any string," she said, "I do 3 things. They're not mystical, they're mechanical. Feet under hips where your bones can hold you. One quiet breath, not a huge gulp like you're about to dive. Just the kind that puts your eyes where you'll need them. Then I check where the front sight is about to live." She lifted her chin toward the imaginary lane. "Do them the same way every time. The brain likes rituals that help it work." Carver nodded slowly. "The recruits." "Will do what you demonstrate," she said, "not what you ask for. If you let your shoulders do the talking, they'll shout. If you let your hands do the work, they'll learn to work." He stood a long beat, then held out his hand. She shook it. He kept his voice low. "Thank you for turning a humiliation into a lesson." She allowed herself the smallest smile, gone, almost before it arrived. "I've had good teachers," she said. They weren't loud. The target hung in the tower that evening. A line of thumbtacks made the corners square. The brass plate arrived the next day from a tiny shop off base, where the owner never asked why the wording mattered to the people who ordered it. The plaque read, "The Blake Double Tap." Competence requires no announcement. For a while, the recruits treated the tower window like a shrine. First relay stopped to look. Third relay asked the story twice to be sure they had the parts in the right order. Someone tried to measure the holes with a caliper and got smacked lightly on the head by a staff sergeant who told him respect doesn't need decimal places. Range culture shifted in ways that were hard to write up and impossible to miss. Carver's voice came down 2 notches, not because he'd lost his edge, but because coaching at a quiet pitch made men lean in to hear, and leaning in made them present. He added Blake's pre-draw check to every brief. Feet breath, sight, he'd say, tapping the air with 2 fingers as if he were knocking on a familiar door. The old hands began to mirror it without thinking. Malfunction drills got sharper. Safety language got cleaner. Tempers cooled when strings went long because the standard had moved off the ego and onto the work. The pattern spread the way improvement always spreads on a competent team from the middle out. The platoon that had watched the shot happen tightened their groups first. The next platoon copied what they saw. In 2 months, the range data ticked up in every category that mattered, and none of the ones that made for good social media. The scores rose, the coaching incidents dropped. The time to clear jams shrank. The number of times a safety needed to be reminded became a rare line on the daily sheet. Hale didn't need a briefing to see it. He could hear it in the sound of a day, a change from sharp, nervous noise to a steadier, more professional hum. He dropped by the bay at odd hours and stood where the gravel met the dust hands behind his back. Eyes on the simple parts, a Marine taking 1 breath before stepping to the line, a holster coming clear without a fight. A young man who used to swing his muzzle like a wand, now letting the barrel lead his eyes to the target as if they belonged together. He stopped one afternoon when he saw Carver standing beside a private whose expression had the sour set of a boy used to being right for reasons that had nothing to do with being good. The kid had said something that made the air tight for a second. Hale watched the old version of Carver swallow a shout, and the newer version lift his chin toward the tower window. "You see that target," Carver said, not asking so much as inviting. "Chief Warrant Officer Blake made those 2 holes with the pistol you're holding right now. When she first showed up, I told her to stay behind the yellow line and stick to sweeping. She didn't argue with me. She did that. The gunny let the quiet sit. She taught me. I'm going to teach you. Start with your feet." The kid didn't balk. Something in the room had shifted. The colonel went back to his office with a small private smile. Blake's presence on the range came and went the way seasons do. You didn't name the day it started or ended. You noticed when a tree turned. Sometimes she was nowhere anyone could find her for a week, and a whisper would pass that she was on temporary duty, someplace where the phones didn't ring. Sometimes she was there at odd hours, reorganizing a parts bin, tagging a worn spring for replacement, running a quiet block with 2 Marines who'd shot themselves into a hole they didn't know how to climb out of. She never stood under her plaque. She never told her story. She didn't avoid it either. When a recruit finally worked up the courage to ask her for the 100th retelling he'd heard third hand, she'd point at the lane, not the tower. "Tripod," she'd say. "Feet under hips. 1 breath. See it." If they wanted a parable, she gave them a practice. If they wanted a hero, she gave them a standard. There are 100 ways to break a pistol draw and 100 ways to ruin a culture. The fixes for both tend to be a lot alike. Eliminate flair, banish hurry. Choose what works over what feels good and do the simplest thing well enough that you don't need to make up for it later. The Bay's new doctrine fit on a 3x5 card. Assumptions are expensive. Precision is cheap. Carver kept a stack of those cards in his breast pocket and handed them out to Marines who thought volume could substitute for craft. Not everything in a story like this fits tidily into one base or one battalion. Some pieces leach into other lives. A reservist carried the lesson back to his police department and noticed his team stopped outrunning their headlights on dark calls. A staff sergeant started checking his temper at home before he put his key in the lock. A captain who had always led with volume tried leading with clarity, and his Marines found they could hear their own brains again. Hale found Blake in the maintenance bay, once sitting on an overturned ammo can, head bent over a pistol frame, a jeweler's file in her hand. The motion of her wrist was so small the light barely picked it up. "Thank you," he said. He didn't specify for what. She didn't look up. "The range is better," she answered, as if he'd told her something else, and she'd decided to make it practical. He glanced at the file, at the tiny bite it took from a burr that had slowed a slide. "Orders." "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes not. You need anything." "Targets that show the truth," she said, and he laughed. The rumor turned true and late autumn inter-service competition was back on the docket, and Quantico would send a team. Carver ran tryouts like a long, steady pole. Nobody got to skate on reputation. Nobody was going to fail for lack of a chance. The recruits talked themselves into and out of courage over coffee, and the old hands said little and brought spare batteries. On the second morning of selection, a thin fog lay in the trees beyond the berm, and breath made little clouds in the air over the line. Blake stood at the far end with a clipboard and a stopwatch. She wore a plain hoodie under her blouse and old boots that had been mended once and would be again before she let them go. She moved so low-key the team forgot she was there until they needed her, and then she was exactly where they expected. Carver's first string ran hot and a little ragged. He caught his own mistake and said nothing. Blake stepped in alongside, not in front. Feet, she said, like a tick. Breath, sight. He repeated it out loud as much for himself as for them, and the next string held. The tryouts ended with a dead heat for the last slot. Carver called for a coin toss. Blake shook her head. Not a coin, she said. A standard. She set 2 fresh targets, called 2 names, and explained a drill that measured mechanics, not luck draw to first shot twice. 4 seconds on the clock, both hits inside the black. She looked at Hale, and he nodded. Both Marines made it. Then we add a reload, she said deadpan. Only 1 Marine stayed clean. The standard chose, and nobody's pride had to do the work of fate. When the team traveled the range at home, did not lose what it had gained. In fact, it deepened. The day the shooters flew out, the staff sergeant under Carver took his place at the line smoother than he'd been 6 months earlier, his voice pitched just where the edge of hearing makes a person lean in. He pointed to the tower window not as a shield, but as a compass. That's what right looks like, he said, echoing the phrase that had started to travel far beyond these few acres of dirt. Blake slipped in and out of the bay less often as winter tightened. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The proof of her presence hung in a frame behind glass, and in small rituals you only notice when they're gone. Hale sent a short note when he signed a piece of paper he couldn't keep a copy of. It said simply, "Thank you for your time at this station. The work speaks for itself." She did not write back. Some lines do not need to be crossed twice. Carver stopped under the tower window one evening when the light made the brass plate glow. A young Marine beside him looked up, hands in his pockets, the posture of a man who hadn't yet learned what his hands were for. Gunny the Kid said, "Is it true she did that with an M18? Not a tuned comp gun or some custom trigger?" Carver didn't blink. "She did it with what you'll carry when it's raining and you're tired," he said. "If that bothers you, it's not the gun." The kid nodded, cheeks coloring. He took his hands out of his pockets. Carver felt a corner of his mouth move. Maybe a smile. Maybe a memory. He reached up and tapped the glass with his knuckle, not hard enough to rattle it. "Competence," he said, speaking the plaque's first word aloud, "requires no announcement." The kid repeated it like a cadence, and they went back to work. It wasn't a big deal when Aaron Blake came back one spring night. No trumpets, no email. She walked in during the hour between late and later when the bay was empty and the fluorescent hum was near enough to a lullaby. She checked a lock, tightened a bolt on a stand, wiped a bit of oil off a grip someone had put away too wet. She stood under the tower window alone and looked up at her own proof. She tilted her head once the way a person does when an old song comes on a radio and catches her by surprise. Hale saw her on the camera feed and didn't go down. It's better sometimes to leave a man or a woman with the room and their thoughts. He watched her touch the frame with 2 fingertips, a gesture between salute and blessing, then step away exactly as she had stepped to the line, heel toe, hands free, eyes quiet. The story didn't end there because stories like this don't end so much as they keep landing in new places. A Marine took it to a guard unit. A guard unit carried it to a sheriff's range. A deputy used it to teach a rook how to survive his first adrenaline dump without shooting his own foot. A father taught it to a daughter with a pellet gun and a soup can in the backyard feet, breath sight. The can fell and she grinned, and he felt a piece of the world turn the way it ought to. You could, if you wanted, strip the whole thing down to a single idea that fits in a pocket with the quarters and the old keys precision beats posture. It beats it on a range. It beats it at a kitchen table. It beats it in a meeting where everyone comes dressed for a fight and no one remembers what victory is supposed to look like. For the older men and women who came to watch, sometimes leaning on a rail with memories that did not always come gently, the lesson rang true in an old register. They'd learned it under different suns, with different tools. They'd learned that the loudest voice at the brief is rarely the steady one at the point. They nodded when Carver said less and coached more. They smiled when a kid who would have barked last year took a breath instead and made his shot. If you'd asked Erin Blake to sum any of this up, she probably would have shrugged. She'd tell you about an elbow as a hinge and a front sight that doesn't lie. She'd remind you that smooth is fast is not a slogan, but a physics problem solved in the body, not the mouth. She'd hand you a blue-handled training gun and say, again, and when you got it right, say the same thing. The rest of us can say the part she left unsaid, that real authority does not arrive with the foghorn of ego, but with the sharp, clean click of a safety done right and the quiet proof left hanging in a tower window. That an institution can change for the better when one person refuses to be anything other than excellent in public. That a range can teach a family. That a double tap fired by a woman someone mistook for a broom carrier can become a doctrine. You can walk past the glass any day they're open and see it there. It hasn't grown less bright. Time and sun have not yellowed the paper yet. The holes stare back, equal steadfast, joined in a figure eight, so small it asks you to lean in. If you stand still, you can almost hear the buzzer again and the two notes that followed. You can almost feel your own elbows lean toward the right shape. There's a place on the wall for more frames. There always will be. But this one earned its brass. And if you're the kind who keeps a notebook in your pocket, there's a line worth stealing for your own life in letters big enough to read in the dark. Take the breath. Find the front sight. Let your actions speak.